Welcome in, Musketeer Report, Billiken Report. We're doing a little podcast here, previewing the Xavier and St. Louis game. Rick Brewing here from Musketeer Report, and Ben Wexelman from Billiken Report, both members of the Scout.com family. Ben, thanks for joining us tonight. Let's talk about this matchup. Obviously, it's got big implications for both teams as far as the big dance goes. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I think when you look at their entire resumes, both Xavier and SLU really need this win, and it's going to be very interesting to see who comes out with the most fire and who really wants it tomorrow night.
Yeah, Lunardi has Xavier as a 12 seed, one of the last four in, playing one of those play-in games. SLU, he has them as a 9 seed. Where does this sort of leave each team if they are to lose this game?
Well, I think for Xavier, you've got to win the A10 tournament, and maybe depending on the matchups, if you get to the A10 final, you can squeeze in there depending on what the bubble's looking like. And with SLU, if you lose, you're still in, but you don't have a very big margin for error. No top 50 wins. A decent resume after that, but still in, but you really have to get some work done in the A10 tournament, and that'll help along with the bye.
And another writer, and you might know who it is, I retweeted him earlier today, had mentioned kind of a good point. If St. Louis is to lose to Xavier, it may give them a top 50 win because it'll probably put Xavier into the top 50 of the RPI after they do win.
Yeah, exactly. I saw that as well. Tom Timmerman from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Exactly, yeah. It's a beat writer for SLU. And that was an interesting point. And a kind of a counterpoint that I made is the fact that SLU owns wins over Xavier, St. Joe's, and Washington, who are all knocking on the door for the top 50 in the RPI. St. Joe's is currently 51, and Washington is 52. And so when you look at that, I mean, SLU could fit somewhere in the range of 0 top 50 wins all the way to 3, and that could obviously have a big implication in terms of getting into the big dance and in terms of what their seed's going to look like.
Well, and right here is sort of a good point. I'm glad you brought this up that I've been making about this bubble. Everyone talks about it being a weak bubble and you're going to be okay because it's a weak bubble. I think that might work the other way in some cases as well. You've got so many different teams with so many different cases where part of their resume matches up with what you expect out of a tournament team, but part of the resume doesn't. In SLU's case, you just mentioned, they're going to sit there and look and say they may have no top 50 wins in the RPI, according to the RPI, but they may have 3, in the top 55. So
right, exactly.
What difference does that really make? You know what I mean? Between the teams that beat the 42nd, 43rd, and 44th versus the 52nd, 53rd, and 54th. I don't think that makes that much of a difference in my opinion. And I think that's where if I'm a team like Xavier or SLU, I'm really wanting to win this game and finish out the season strong because I don't want to be in a situation where there's a lot of guesswork going on Selection Sunday, especially with this bubble, because I think there's a lot of teams, Lunardi has a team like South Florida out right now. I think when it's all said and done with, they'll have a strong case for making the tournament when they, after playing in the Big East tournament. I think there's going to be a lot of teams like that have a strong case when it's all said and done with in some form or fashion, and I wouldn't want to be on this bubble because I think there's going to be so many different things being looked at that you just never know what they may consider and a tournament team.
Yeah, I also think it's kind of funny. People are saying this is such a weak bubble. One of the stat heads out there went ahead and did a statistical analysis of things and actually came up with a normal distribution this year compared to other years. And so while people kind of say, oh, it's a weak bubble, looking at historical data, it's actually not. But getting back to your point, I think both teams most definitely don't want to make this a guesswork situation. I mean, anybody in their right mind wants to just continue to win, and really that's all you can do at this point. It doesn't matter. You can't look and say, oh, well, we don't have RPI wins over this team or that team. I mean, as long as you're winning, you're going to make a pretty strong case for the tournament. And That's all these two teams especially can ask for at this juncture.
And we do this every year, right? I mean, we say this every year that it's a weak bubble, and it's getting to be pretty cliche, to be honest. But I do think it reminds us every year at this time of the tournament how thin that line has become between the high majors, the mid majors, the mid major minuses, all these different teams we try to label. I think it just reminds us sometimes how thin that line has become. And I think part of it is you've got guys leaving early, so you have some of the elite teams playing with the younger players, whereas some of the mid majors are playing with 4-year seniors. I think that sort of blurred the line. I think that's the point when it comes down to this selection Sunday time is not so much that there's a weak bubble, but just that line's been blurred between all these different teams, and it's tough because there's so many good basketball players out there now.
Right, and I think also something that's interesting too is depending on which bracket projection you look at, the A10 is just crazy. I mean, you can go all the way from 3 is the most common, I would say. But I actually saw a bracket projection today. Forget where from, but a reputable individual, and they had 5 teams in along with Dayton and St. Joe's. And so, I mean, this could really be crazy because Dayton and St. Joe's have definitely positioned themselves on the bubble, and SLU and Xavier are even being considered kind of teetering back and forth. And it'll be interesting to see what happens just 13 days from now.
But here's my thing on that. I don't think 5 teams from the A10 will be able to make it because someone will have to lose in those situations. You know what I mean? Like, all those teams, I think, would have to really win out to sort of bolster their case, and that's not going to happen.
Sure. I don't think there's any doubt about it at all.
Because it'd take multiple teams making a run in the A10 tournament as well, and that's just not going to happen. 5 teams aren't going to get in from the A10. It's just not the way the world works.
Sure, but I think when you look at things, SLU and Xavier still they both control their own destiny at this point, and obviously, you've got to give SLU the upper hand tomorrow, just because they are at home. Senior night, for what it's worth, I think that's overrated. However, they have the confidence having beaten Xavier already at Cintas, and it'll be interesting to see kind of what this game is like, especially having seen how both teams have progressed over the past 8 or so games since January 25th.
Yeah, and let's get into that. Let's go ahead and start breaking this matchup down. Of course, Xavier and SLU going at it tomorrow night at St. Louis. 5-3 Xavier is in their last 8 games since the last time these two teams played. And I think when you look over the last 3 games more so, it just shows you how up and down Xavier's been. They've played really well not really well. They've played really well in a home win over Dayton, and fairly well, especially for the first 12 minutes. They played exceptional in the home win over Richmond. And then they played really poorly in road losses to Dayton and UMass. So I think it's, which Xavier team comes out is going to be a big part of this, obviously. The road hasn't been kind to Xavier. So playing at SLU doesn't bode well for Musketeer fans. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Talk a little bit about how SLU's done in the last 8 games.
Well, they're 6-2 during that stretch. And obviously, they lost the game right after the big Xavier win. They go on the road to UMass, take a loss there. They were out of it from the beginning. UMass shot the lights out in the first half and just sunk them. They came back for a little bit in the second half before free throw woes put them completely behind and could never mount a charge after that. Then you reel off 6 straight wins and have another clunker on the road at Rhode Island, which is really a bad loss. That was a 5-win team going in, 5-23 on the season. Obviously, they had beaten Dayton and hung with some pretty solid teams. But that, once again, I mean, if you're going to be a secure NCAA team, that's not a loss you can take. But in there, February 8th and February 11th, back-to-back wins at St. Joe's, at LaSalle, really put them in a great situation. And so they've played very well in stretches, and I would go ahead and say about 95% of that time, outside of the Rhode Island game. And, they played really well for a half at UMass. But it'll be interesting to see what happens to Xavier in terms of will they kind of lay down and say, all right, well, we let Rhode Island get one away from us, and where are we going to go from here? Or are they going to step up and say, hey, it's senior night, trying to clinch a bid. We haven't been in the NCAA tournament since 2000. What's going to happen is obviously going to be determined tomorrow night. But, what do you think the matchups are looking like at this point?
Well, let me ask you something about what you just kind of said. You mentioned that, the loss to Rhode Island, and will they mentally get back together and sort of get right to where they need to be to win this game and make a run here. What kind of team is St. Louis? You're around them more often than obviously myself or any Xavier fans are. What kind of group are they? There's been a lot of questions about Xavier's team chemistry and whatnot, but what about St. Louis? Because this is the most different looking group of cats I've ever seen together on the basketball court. I mean, do they have pretty good chemistry, or what's the deal with these guys?
Absolutely, and I think that's a really interesting question, because obviously you hear, in speaking to you, obviously, and from other folks, you hear that Xavier doesn't have the best chemistry. SLU gets along. The whole team, really has some nice chemistry, and they're led by Brian Conklin. He's a great leader in terms of on and off the floor. And then with a guy like Kwame Mitchell, yeah, he's a junior, but he's red-shirted and really provides that leadership from the point guard position. And they're a team that's capable of bouncing back. So I don't think that's necessarily a huge problem for them. They lose a UMass game when they really needed to go on the road and win, and then they come back and reel off 6 straight. And so they've obviously got the perseverance factor in them. It'll be interesting to see kind of how they show up tomorrow night.
Yeah, when you talk about the Xavier chemistry issues, I think that's a little overblown. And I don't know that it's chemistry as much as it is other things that just relate to basketball. And sometimes people want a magic answer to say, oh, this is what the blame should be placed on. But it's not that simple. Sometimes there's a lot of moving parts that affect different things, and whether, you can throw out a lot of different factors that everyone wants to blame all the blame on, and really it's probably multiple things that share portions of the blame. And so I don't know that it's so much that these guys don't like each other or can't get along on the court, as it is that they haven't had some guys step up in the way that other leaders have in the past. But part of it is because they played with other leaders. They played earlier in their career. Guys like Tu always had leaders coming up. He's been an underclassman playing since he got to campus. So I think that sometimes plays a role in it. But regardless of all that, I think with Xavier, they've turned it around a little bit as far as all that stuff goes. I think Tu Holloway, Mark Lyons have been a lot better in practice as of late, especially Mark Lyons, who, as you know, was benched for a little while from his starting position. I think the coaches have been a lot happier with what they've seen out of him at practice. He seemed to be, really trying to go above and beyond and go out of his way to do the right things and be a good role model. And, just for the other game, he had given tickets. He had gone and done a workshop, a little basketball teaching lesson to a group of after-school kids, I think, at a local school. And he had just done that recently. And so sometimes Mark Lyons gets a bad rap for his toughness on the court and the way that he acts. But at the same time, he also can be, a good guy as well. And I think he sort of earned his way back into the good graces of his teammates and the coaches for this final stretch. I think that's important for the Xavier team. I think as far as leadership goes and stuff like that, they're going to be okay down the stretch. Now, the basketball side of things is another story. They still have some issues when it comes to on-the-court things. So it's more than just team chemistry holding this team back.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think that's a very valid point. Kind of something I wanted to talk about, because I do watch pretty much every Xavier game. I watch them the next day on Synergy. And what I've noticed is, that's a very good point, that the team chemistry factor is very overblown, I feel, as well. But the inconsistency is still there. For me watching these games, it's like Tu and Mark have a good game, but Kenny does not have a good game, and vice versa. And they can't get all the parts going at the same time, and that's something that worries me.
And that might also come down to what we determine a good game for Tu and Mark. right? Because when they have 25 points, that might not tell the full story. And in some games, I don't think it has. They've been guys who have sort of been here's the thing about Tua and Mark. They're both ball stoppers just by the way they play. They're good in isolation situations, beating their man off the dribble, and Xavier's offense kind of lends itself for them to be creative, but at the same time, you're also going to have two guys doing that in your offense, being ball stopper type players. That's not always good when you're having trouble scoring, having trouble with guys who have confidence issues in the post, finishing around the basket, when they're not going to see the ball, when they're not involved in the offense. That sometimes creates issues, and that's why Xavier's been a much better team as of late when, one, Mark Lyons has ran the point and pushed the pace a little bit, and two, Xavier's just had quicker ball movement. I thought they made a great move last game against Richmond, that switching defense. They left Kenny Freeze in the post for most of the game. Instead of having him to come out to set the ball screens like normal, he stayed in the post. And what that did was, for one, it confused Richmond's switching defense a little bit because they had to figure out who was staying with cutters and who was picking them up and at what point. Whereas when you go and set the screen, you make that really easy to decide who's switching when. So that was one part of it. But the other part was it gave Kenny a lot more opportunities to get the ball, get a look, and also created ball movement. Kenny's a pretty underrated passer out of the post, and it just sort of seemed to open things up. There was a lot more cutting, a lot just more pace to the overall flow of the offense. And I think that's why Xavier's been a much better team when they've played that way, because they have some other issues. You know, Des Wells is a guy who can really score for this team off the bounce, but he's got to have the touches and he's got to be involved throughout the course of the game. Otherwise, when he finally gets that touch, it results in I've got to take a quick three, or I've got to force my way to the basket and pick up a charge. Right.
Yeah, there's kind of a player like that on SLU that I wanted to talk a little bit about. Dwayne Evans, who's 6'5" forward, doesn't seem like a very imposing figure. But he's got 6 double-doubles on the year. My issue with him is he only has 9 double-figure points games all year, and so when he gets them, he's getting them in bunches, but he hasn't provided that consistency that I think that a lot of SLU fans would really, really like to see out of him as a sophomore. Obviously, Brian Conklin has been the leader of this team. He's been the model of consistency for this team all year long. And Kwame Mitchell, although he hasn't reverted to his sophomore form, he's still been clutch, very much so at times. And then when you add pieces like Mike McCall, who's now entered the starting lineup instead of senior Kyle Cassidy, and you've got a guy like Jordair Jett, who can come in and really D people up. SLU's got some people there, and even more so. I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but Rob Lowe from the outside, he had 3 3-pointers when SLU played January 25th at Xavier, and he's got that ability even at 6'11" to be able to step out and knock that jumper down. He needs to do it on a more consistent basis. Shooting 34% from the 3-point lines and really not going to get it done.
No, you're exactly right. But the last time these two teams met up, the guards didn't seem to be much of a problem for Xavier. I felt, obviously they've got a pretty talented backcourt. Mark Lyons hits 5 threes, which greatly helped Xavier to even stay in that game. Otherwise, I think they really would have been in trouble. But when you look back at that game, it's not Kwame Mitchell who worries you too much. It's not Cassidy. It's not Mike McCall. But Conklin, it's Lowe. It's Ellis when he came in the game. Those were the guys who really seemed to torch Xavier, especially when they'd get on those runs. It'd be a couple quick threes. Someone scores in the post. They get an offensive rebound, whatever the case may be, which, Rob Lowe ends up with 4 offensive rebounds in that game. Really hurt Xavier from that aspect. I thought that's where Xavier really struggled in this game. And I think that's the key again. I think that's the key again tomorrow night when they play is it's going to be how do they handle those forwards.
I couldn't agree more. I remember vividly, Ellis knocked down 3 3-pointers in that game, and 2 of them, I think, were in the first 3 or 4 minutes. He was lights out along with Rob Lowe. But Conklin was he feasted inside, and And, Kenny Freese took 3 shots the entire game. He was nowhere to be found. And that's something that if that happens tomorrow night, I mean, Xavier's really going to be on the line if Kenny Freese doesn't show up. Obviously, the last 2 games, I think 31 points and 22 rebounds combined for him. And if he's got another nice performance in him, this is going to be a wonderful game to watch.
And this is the Kenny Freese that Xavier needs. It's what a lot of people expected out of him this entire year. It's had its ups and downs for various reasons. He's struggled in a lot of games, especially the last time they played SLU. I mean, that was one of probably his lowest points on the team. You're talking about 3 field goal attempts. He makes 1 shot. He makes 1 out of 3. He makes 1 free throw. He ends up with 4 points. You know, and that's not getting it done, especially when you're in an important conference game and supposed to be a senior leader. He did have 5 rebounds in 18 minutes, which isn't horrible, but he's got to come to play, and this team is so much better when they can get productivity out of Kenny Freese in the post. But I think part of this is on the guards as well. We've seen a lot of times Kenny Freese struggle a little bit in the first half. He misses a layup or 2 or 3 or 4. And then he doesn't see the ball again the rest of the game, and he's really become a non-factor for the whole game now. And what that does is a lot of times the defense, after that pick and roll happens in the ball screen offense, they just go and really leave that second defender who's defending the big man, be it Kenny in this case, they bring him up to help against 2 or Mark, who's ever trying to penetrate. And if you think about a defender, if they have to stay with Kenny all the way until the last second, they're going to be meeting 2 around the charge circle or midway through the lane. At that point, it's an and 1. Where they're meeting him now is near the free throw line, where they're able to cut off his penetration and just sort of force him back out. He bounces a dribble out, takes some more time off the shot clock. We end up with a contested 3. And that's sort of what you've seen out of that Xavier offense when they've struggled. And I think when they go to the big men, he doesn't have to make the shot every time. And that's what you saw just the other night against Richmond is Kenny missed about 4 or 5 there to close the first half. They kept going to him in the second half. It kept opening things up both for the guards and the big men, and Kenny was able to finish with a huge performance.
Right. I mean, obviously we had talked about it a little bit before. 8 games since that showdown. Where have the matchups changed? Obviously we broke down the matchups once before prior to that game, but kind of who I guess do you see playing a different role than they did in that first matchup?
Well, I think the one person you got to look at that's going to have a completely different impact on this game is going to be Des Wells. He had no points the first time these 2 teams played. He had just 3 field goal attempts, and that's in 24 minutes, so it's not like he missed most of the game for an injury or anything like that. He played a majority of that game and just struggled a little bit. He had 4 rebounds, 2 on the offensive side of things. He did have a couple of assists and a couple of steals, but they need him to be a more consistent impact player, and I think that's what you've seen recently. He's been playing a lot better. He was just named the Freshman of the Week in the Atlantic 10 for his efforts at UMass and Richmond, so he's been playing pretty well as of late. His energy is huge for this team, but he needs to be a guy that does 2 things a little bit better, and one is block out on the defensive end because he's been giving up a lot of key offensive rebounds, and you've sort of heard Coach Mack talk about that. Even after some of his great performances, that's been the one thing Coach Mack has pointed to is his defensive rebounding and blocking out and not allowing other teams to get second chance buckets over him. And the other thing is the defensive rotations. He does a pretty good job when he's on the ball, but at times where Xavier's given up wide open looks from the perimeter has just been guys rotating in the wrong way. They haven't sort of scrambled in the way you have to when you defend lots of screens as lots of teams are using in college basketball these days. You have to be able to scramble well, and Xavier hasn't really done that, which has led to some of those open shots on the perimeter, and part of that has been Des Wells just being a freshman and sort of learning what he's doing out there. So those are 2 areas where he needs to improve still, but I think when it comes to points, rebound, energy, he's going to bring a whole lot more this time around when they play SLU. How about the same question on the St. Louis side of things?
I think you got to go to Mike McCall. Obviously, he didn't get the start there, only played 23 minutes, but he only took 2 shots. And that's definitely not something you're going to see tomorrow night. He's going to get a lot more playing time. I feel like maybe not huge. He might not reach the 30-minute plateau, but he'll be in there in the high 20s. He'll definitely take more than 2 shots. He's feeling a lot more confident with things. He said it publicly now that he's starting. He feels a lot more in tune with everybody on the team. Just feels a lot more confident about his game, and I think that's something that will likely show through. In the game tomorrow night. I mean, getting 4 points all on free throws at Xavier is just clearly not something that he has in mind for tomorrow night, and I don't think it's something you're going to see. He's really been improving. He has the best plus-minus on the team for what that's worth by far in the Atlantic 10. And so when you look at him, I think you're going to see a lot of things, especially, getting 2 and Mark in at the same time. I think you're going to see Mike and Kwame in a lot as well. And so that's something to look forward to. He's taken 23 shots in the last 2 games. And so when you kind of just look at that and see his confidence rising, I think that's going to continue into tomorrow night's game.
Yeah, I think one of the things Xavier fans remember most about that game was the 3-point shooting. 7 for 21 isn't as ridiculous as it sort of seemed that day. I think it was just the fact that Ellis and Lowe were both burying a triplet of threes out there was kind of unexpected. But when you look at the way St. Louis has kind of shot the ball, they were shooting it pretty well for most of the season, but they've slowed down in conference play a little bit. They're shooting just 33% in the conference. So it's not like they've exactly set the world on fire shooting the ball from the outside, and Xavier might get a little bit of a break this time around.
Yeah, without a doubt, but I think at the same time you can't really understate the fact that Cody Ellis had 3 3-pointers. I mean, he's had a game where he's had 6 this year. He's had a game where he's had 5. And so he's got that potential. If you leave him open, he's going to can some threes. I think the thing that Xavier fans will remember the most about that game is the fact that they came so early. If I remember correctly, Lowe hit 2 very early and Ellis hit 2. That might have been before the under 12 media timeout, if I remember correctly.
They
in the
both
first
were.
half.
They were right in front of me. At least 2 of them were right in that wing right area, right in front of me where I sit, just left of midcourt in front of Xavier's bench at Cintas. And you're exactly right. It happened so quick, and I think that's the thing about the St. Louis team is the spurt ability of those 3-pointers that took them into the lead so quickly is what Xavier fans remember about it. And really, it wasn't that Xavier gave up a ridiculous amount of threes. I mean, 7 threes is a fair amount, but at 21, you're talking about 33%.
Absolutely. Well, another thing too that people have to remember, I mean, Xavier lost by 5 points, but without Mark Lyons in that game, it would have been double digits for sure, and probably much worse. I mean, Mark Lyons was unbelievable in that game. He hit shots from everywhere. He hit shots with multiple guys on him. He was on fire. I think at one point he had hit 5, 6 shots in a row, and 4 or 5 of those were threes. And so when you look at tomorrow night's matchup, it's really going to come down to, obviously, it's cliche to say who wants it more, but kind of who executes.
Yeah, and I think that's what we all kind of mean when we say that, because who doesn't want to play hard? I mean, it's like Xavier. People saying Xavier didn't want it when they went to Dayton. Well, that's their rival. Of course they wanted it. You know what I mean? How can you not play hard? Well, I don't think it's as much that they don't play hard as they just don't understand it. They don't come ready to play. They don't execute. They kind of get that deer in the headlights look to them, and that's what that means, I think, more than anything, is what you said. You got to go out and execute and make the plays, and Xavier's just had trouble doing that on the road this year. Let's go ahead and talk about keys for this game. If you had to talk about 2 things SLU must do this and this to win this ball game, what are those 2 things?
Well, they got to hit some outside shots. I mean, as you said, they haven't been doing it so well in the A10 conference play thus far. But as they've shown this year, when they're winning, they're hitting threes. And in the 6 losses, they've really been pretty putrid from the 3-point line, and that includes against Rhode Island on Saturday. And then also, I think you've got to stay with what worked last time. You've got to feed the ball to Conklin and get him touches early. He's been the one guy that's just really been phenomenal this year for the Billikens. And so to shy away from him and do more guard play just really might not be the game plan for tomorrow night. I think they definitely need to get him some post touches, maybe get Kenny Freese in some foul trouble, and see where it takes him.
Yeah, no question. I agree with you on both those points. On the SLU side of things, on the Xavier side of things, I'm going to kind of wrap a few things into one, and that's just playing with pace on the offensive side of the ball. That means moving the ball quickly, not getting to a lot of situations where you see two or Mark patting the ball, over-dribbling a little bit too much. They need to whip it around the perimeter a little more, use their screens, attack the basket when they have the opportunities, but keep the offense moving and flowing. It also includes getting the big guys involved. You've got to get Kenny consistent touches. You've got to make him become a factor. If another guy like Jeff Robinson or Andre Walker or Travis Taylor are able to step up and provide some production, you go ahead and you give them some love too and get them a few more touches. But you've got to keep that consistent because it makes the defense stay honest, and that's key for keeping driving lanes open for two and Mark when it comes down the stretch. And then the thing defensively, I'd just say, Xavier's got to come with that energy that they sometimes bring, and it when you see it. It was definitely there for the first 12 minutes of that Richmond game. They held them scoreless through 2 media timeouts. That's almost unheard of. They just really got after it. They were tough. They were smart on their rotations. But here's the biggest thing, and this has a lot to do with the three-point shooting as well. They've got to be tough against screens, and that's both guards and big men. The big men have to redirect the ball, give a good hedge, but the guards have to really attack that screen, get over it, fight to get through it, blow it up, so they're not waiting too long. The big man doesn't have to own that ball screen for too long, and you don't have to end up switching it like Xavier did last game, and then, Lowe gets to take advantage inside or whoever it may be. We saw that happen in the second half when Xavier started switching screens. You don't want those big on-guard mismatches, so Xavier just needs to do a better job like they've shown they're capable of the past couple games.
Absolutely. I think also, just to add one more key, they've got to shoot free throws well. SLU has really struggled at times, especially in their losses from the free throw line. At Xavier, they were completely and utterly clutch down the stretch. Obviously, Xavier shoots 29 of 32. That's phenomenal. That's another factor why they stayed in the game for so long. But SLU down the stretch was great. And I think it was 12 of 13 or 13 of the last 14 that they made. And, if this game's down the stretch very, very close, they're going to need some help from the charity stripe.
Yeah, neither one of these teams great in the conference. Xavier sitting at 6th in the conference when it comes to free throw percentage. St. Louis is at 10th, so I agree. Right. It's definitely key for both these teams to shoot the ball well. We're down to prediction time. Who do you like in this one?
I'm going to take St. Louis. I think Las Vegas, the early line was 8 points. I think that's far too high. I had it more at about 4.5, 5. So I think that Xavier's definitely going to keep it close. But when it comes down to it, not that SLU necessarily needs it more, because Xavier really, really needs it. But I feel like, I can't trust Xavier on the road quite yet. Having watched so many of their games, it's so hard for me to take the Musketeers on the road, especially at a tough place like St. Louis. It's expecting a sellout tomorrow night, and they've only lost one game at home all year, and that was against Temple, who's obviously one of the better teams in the country. And so I think when you combine the talent that SLU's got this year with the, for whatever it's worth, the factor at home, I'm not even going to consider senior night because that is what it is. But I'll take SLU in this. But I will say it's going to be a very good game and come down to the last 2 or 3 minutes.
Well, I'm right on the same line of thinking as you. I've got SLU 72, Xavier 68 as my final score prediction. Like you said, I think it's right around that 4 to 5 point range. And for the exact reason that you mentioned, how can you trust this Xavier team on the road right now? They've shown it in flashes. They've shown the ability to be good enough. They're certainly talented enough to beat a team like SLU, and they can play well enough to do that. We've seen it recently at home. We've yet to see it on the road. It's hard to say, that they're going to turn it around now all of a sudden. At this point in the season, you kind of are what you are until you can prove otherwise, and that's the case with Xavier right now. So I'm going to go ahead and go with SLU as well on the road. Any final thoughts before I get to these final two questions that we've already addressed anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one final thing that's worth talking about is just to go along with that point of the struggles on the road. I mean, obviously, everyone remembers that they played great against Vanderbilt and they got the win. But you look at their road since, I mean, they beat a Fordham team, they beat Charlotte, they beat GW. Those are their road wins.
Yep.
I mean, they're none of those teams are, popping out off the page. And so it makes you wonder, can they pull the upset against SLU? Maybe, but I'm not gonna take my chances and pick it. That's for sure.
No, I'm on the same wavelength, and I do think the Xavier team. Anytime you're talking about the matchups, when I do those articles, when we talk about it on here, when you talk about score predictions and stuff, it all depends on which Xavier team we're talking about. Are we talking about the one where Tu and Mark share the ball and play as the dynamic duo in the backcourt that also gets their teammates involved and make the whole team better, and the team that plays as gangbusters on the defensive end and doesn't allow a point for 12 minutes of the game? Well, yeah, that Xavier's certainly good enough to win and certainly good enough to be in the NCAA tournament and have a chance at making a run. The question is, can this group of guys come together for the last however many weeks that they have left, depending on how well they fare down the stretch, and make the best of this last run? If they can do that, they're certainly good enough to make some noise down the stretch, but they haven't proven that on a consistent basis just yet, so we'll wait and see. Obviously, Tuesday night's game will be a big step in either direction.
Yeah, I think that the same goes for SLU, and I think just to some extent you can say that about any team, which team will show up. But obviously, you look at the flop against Rhode Island. Is that team going to show up, or are you going to have a team like the Billikens team that went into Cintas and cracked a 43-game home conference streak? I mean, who knows? It's going to be a lot of fun to watch, though. That's all I know.
Yeah, it should be a good one tomorrow night. Let's get to a couple questions I received from Twitter. I won't read names out because I'm not even sure if they want that. But we kind of addressed these already, but we'll go ahead and read them anyway just because I said I would. The first one is, what should X do differently defensively to guard big guys that can shoot? It's been a problem all season, especially versus SLU last game. No, well, that's true. It has been an issue. Here's my thing on this. It hasn't always been the same issue. That's the problem. It'd be real easy to just point and say, everyone wants to say, well, we can't defend pick and rolls, talking about Xavier on the message board. And that is the case to an extent, but they act like everyone else in the world can. If you haven't noticed, college basketball is basically lots of ball screens. There's a few teams that still run an older style of offense, like the flex or something like that. They're mostly in the Big Ten. I wouldn't recommend watching it. But, there are a lot of ball screens being run, and there's a reason for that. It's tough to guard. It puts you in a tough situation as a defense, and that's what Xavier's just struggled with. Their personnel, for whatever reason, they've been taught the same way past defensive teams at Xavier have been very good at it, and the guys just haven't taken to it quite yet. I think the two things you've seen they've struggled with is just the rotations. Guys run to the wrong person when they're trying to scramble. I think on the ball screens, the guards haven't attacked them all that well and tried to fight over hard enough, while the big men haven't done a good enough job of hedging and owning that ball screen temporarily. You've got to redirect the ball and make it so there's not an easy passing lane back to the pick and pop guy, and that's what Xavier really has to do. I don't like them switching the screens all that much. I thought that gave them more problems than just defending them regularly did last time when they went to that in the second half. So I think they should stick with it. But, I don't get paid to make those type of decisions, and I think the coaching staff knows the team plenty well. It's just a matter of getting consistent execution, because at times they do defend it very well. This Xavier's team problem has just been that the consistency isn't always there. Sometimes they really struggle, and it's just mental lapses or different guys having different issues at different times. But either way, the result is the same, and that's been open looks from the perimeter. Go ahead.
I'm really glad that you said that it's tough for every team in college to guard ball screens, because you're right on. That's so true. People think that, it just happens to their team, and especially if one game they get burnt, like happened to Xavier, especially in the first half of that Xavier SLU game. But in all reality, Xavier fans really need to know that tomorrow night's game is going to be running through Conklin. I mean, SLU is not a team that lives and dies by the three. If they were, they'd score 70 or 80 points a game. Not be closer to the 50s and 60s. So it's one of those things that you look at and you say, yeah, they can most definitely, as a Xavier fan, you say, yeah, we can most definitely do better at the ball screens. However, there's always going to be lapses once or twice here and there. Someone's going to make a tough shot in your face or things like that. But I think that's a valid question, though. I think, if they don't hedge out on the ball screens, it could be really tough for them to contain SLU from the outside.
Yeah, and I don't think there's one party that's been more at fault this year in that case for Xavier. I think at times it's really been the bigs. I think at times it's been, like I mentioned, Des Wells struggling on rotations, things of that nature. I think at times it's certainly been Tu and Mark, getting a little, not necessarily lazy on defense, but just sluggish. Sort of like Coach Mack always talks about being stuck in mud. That's sort of how they look at times. They're just not moving hard enough, fast enough, with enough urgency when defending those screens. The guards are just as important as the big men are in that hedge, and giving the big men an opportunity to be able to give a good hedge. And it's the same way on the offensive end when you're setting the screen. The guard is just as important in using it as the big man is in setting it. And as to the point, about all teams struggling against the ball screen, I mean, you just constantly read these message board posts about the coaching staff not being able to figure out how to defend it. Well, it's not the coaching staff, okay? There's all different philosophies, but, Roy Williams doesn't know how to defend it either, apparently, because Austin Rivers hit a game winner against him. How far are we going to go with this? Every team gets beat with ball screens. It's just a matter of your guys executing your plan. Sometimes, maybe you should try something else, a different way of doing it, because your personnel doesn't do your specified way correctly. It just doesn't suit them well. But in Xavier's case, I don't think that's it. I think guys got to lock in. They've got to play better. I don't think there's any coach that can come in with some miracle defense to guard the ball screen that's going to make it magically happen. It's up to the players doing it the right way. And, obviously it's a way that's been very successful for Xavier over the past couple years. It's sort of up to the players at that point, in my opinion.
I could
go ahead.
Couldn't agree more. I'm just saying, I think you're right on, especially with, the fact that, how far are we going to take it? Everyone has lapses here and there, and those are the things that get on the message boards and that people remember, for better or for worse.
Right, and that's why we have sports. That's why sports is so entertaining, because sometimes teams that are supposed to be good and have enough talent to be good don't execute those things for whatever reason. Things like defending the pick and roll. It comes down to basketball, things like that, and for whatever reason, when you don't do it well because of various reasons, you end up in a situation like Xavier, and that's why sports are fun. It doesn't always play out the way that it should, and it's not always a miracle answer that if you do it this way, it'll work every time,
Right.
Let's go ahead and get to that second question. The second one, along the same lines in some way, not just specifically with the bigs, though. It's why is X's three-point defense so atrocious, and when did the coaching staff realize that our bigs cannot finish inside? Well, the three-point defense being atrocious, again, it hasn't been one reason. I think that's the toughest thing for people to understand. I go back and I watch all these games with the remote in hand off the DVR, and I sit there. It takes me about 3.5, 4 hours to watch through them. Yeah, I have no life, but you rewind, you rewatch, and And you look for a common theme, and sometimes there's just not one with this Xavier team. It's been, I remember one game I counted about 5 different open threes that they gave up in a row. And I went back and watched each 5 reason, and all 5 of them were different. One was, a bad job by the big man on the hedge. Another job was a bad job by the guard not getting there. The next one was Tu Holloway not hustling back on defense after a bad offensive possession, a turnover or something of that nature, not getting in position. So people had to scramble for him. He never got to it, and the man who had scrambled for him's man was wide open in the corner for a 3. And then they had another situation where I think it was Travis Taylor had just jumped to the wrong man, ended up double teaming a guy on the wrong wing when they were trying to scramble. So again, it's different issues every time for Xavier. Not every time. Sometimes they struggle with the same things, but there's not one thing you can just pin it on. It's just got to be the defense locking in on their assignments and just having that consistency. Guys like Dante Jackson and Jamel McLean were so good in the system. They were experienced, and they were all about winning. And those guys, you realize why they got so much playing time on last year's team, especially with Dante when he struggled to produce at all. On the offensive end, he'd play 40 minutes still. It was hard to figure it out at times, but you see how important he was, just having guys in the right positions, him being in the right position himself, being a tough defender, things of that nature. Sometimes they go a long way and account for more than we realize. As far as the big guys not being able to finish inside, I'll admit it's been a struggle for these big men the entire year, and I don't know the reason why. And everyone, is talking about how bad Travis Taylor is against finishing against size. I don't think Travis Taylor can't score because I see him do it. I see him do it in the summer. I see him do it against Kenny Freeze. I see him do it against other guys that came in, guys like Deshaun Butler and NBA guys that came and ran open gym. He can score. Why he struggles in games, I don't know. It seems like he's a little nervous or can't seem to settle in. But the staff hasn't realized that. I mean, there's not some magic moment where they said, oh, our big guys can't finish, we're just going to write them off for the rest of the year. You're always developing, you're always working with a senior like Kenny Freeze to hope that moment clicks, and look how it paid off for them, the other night against Richmond. Kenny gets 19 and 14. He ends up sort of sealing that game off with 2 huge rebounds. And confidence is a big thing with Kenny Freeze. You keep him going throughout the game, even if he misses those couple early, and he pays off down the line with 2 big rebounds because he's still hustling and still involved in the game mentally. And that's a big key for this team. They need to keep feeding those big men even when they don't finish, because it opens things up. It also keeps them involved in the game mentally.
Yeah, I think that's funny that you address that, and you have people talking about bigs missing shots down low. I think that's been one of SLU's Achilles heel this entire year, is not just bigs, but everybody, just layups missed left and right. There have been games where, whether it be a layup or a tip in, you look at the play-by-play, it's been double digits in multiple games, and that's just not something that can happen because every one of those buckets, they obviously all count for 2, but every time you miss one, it just not only deflates you off the scoreboard, but it deflates your morale, and it doesn't let you get into a really nice rhythm. So that's interesting that the Xavier fans have talked about it hurting the Musketeers in terms of the inside play, but from SLU's standpoint, it's really hurt the Billikens from just about any position on the court.
Yep, Billiken Report is where you can find Ben Wexelman's work for all my fans here at MusketeerReport.com. Ben, what can they expect after the game? Will you have any additional content up?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell. I'm not sure if Chris will be in the media room as well.
He usually is. I think you'll probably get him.
Yeah, this year, that's what they used to do in the past. The past couple of years, they've had the away teams come in as well. This year, it's been mostly just Rick and some players, but hopefully I'll be able to get some things from Chris as well. If not, obviously, Byron does a great job on the radio. You guys can catch him there. Also, follow both of us on Twitter. We'll have updates throughout the game.
What's your Twitter handle? Tell them where to follow you at.
BWEX, BWEIX Scout, and otherwise, just a mention to fans from both teams. Enjoy it. Obviously, it's going to be tough to sit back and not be on the edge of your seat, especially if it's close late. But try your best to just enjoy it for what you can, because I really think it's going to be a great game tomorrow night.
It should be a good one. All you Billiken Report fans, you can follow live game updates on our side of things. At Musketeer Report is the Twitter handle to look for. Ben, appreciate you joining us. We'll have to do it again another time.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate it.
All right, for Ben Wexelman at Billiken Report, I'm Rick Broering, MusketeerReport.com. Thanks for tuning in.